Good morning to all of you, and welcome to the last day of the conference. But for, I think, many of us on the dais, and for me, it's perhaps one of the most exciting topics for the day, which is self, the concept of self. And as much as possible, we plan to focus the idea of self in neuropsychiatry, neurophenomenology, and neurophilosophy. Let me share with you a few thoughts on the idea of self, because when we talk about consciousness, it's very important that we understand what is the place of the notion of self. There are two major streams of discussion on the self. Self is debated as a cognitive concept that helps tie the missing ends between the physical and the psychological functions. Also, self is argued to be the locus of all our conscious experiences. Friends, what is indubitable is that there is a single unit of information and experience that connects sensation, emotion, and memories, which we lovingly call as our self. It's agreed that human behaviors, attitudes, and emotions are intricately tied to the neural structures on one side and the indivisible experiential self on the other. Today, brain and self are the common threads that are used by neuropsychiatry, neurophenomenology, and philosophy to get some hold on one of the most intractable problems of humankind, namely consciousness. To address the place of the self in the brain is to address the unity, adherence, and continuity of experience. A major challenge to this effort is the fact that though we tend to commonly address a static unit by calling it self, the self is constantly emerging. It's an emerging phenomenon as a result of its interaction with nature outside, social and biological, and the nurture inside, which is our mind and our personality. In the process of its emergence, we also know that the boundaries of the self seem to change, creating havoc for some in the case of psychiatric challenges and peace for others in the case of spiritual experiences. Philosophically, it's interesting that we continue to ask about mind-body unity, how the mind and body, qualitatively different, can connect and give rise to meaning and quality of life. There are some pertinent questions which stay in our mind, and they continue to be in this morning as well. Where and how in the brain is the self housed? How does the self make adaptive changes in one's personality corresponding to changes in the brain? How does the self alter and influence neurochemical functions of the brain? Can the brain address its structural and functional challenges without the recourse to the self? Can there be a self without the interface of the brain and the limbic system? And finally, are the brain and self constantly challenging each other? These and similar questions may not give immediate answers, considering the complex ways in which both our brain and self are cross-wired. The most fascinating problem that brings us all together here is to find how does the brain and self conceive their role play and create, let me say, a conspiracy of experience where somehow the physicality of the brain is lost and the magic of the subjectivity is created. How does the function of the physical object, the brain, give rise to a personal, subjective, rich consciousness? Or how or why does the subject come from the object? Now, is this question a foolproof one? Why do we assume that the subject comes from the object? Is it possible that the subject itself has fashioned the object to be what it is? If this question is relevant, then purpose, intention, and meaning of what we sensate become important. And therefore, let me say, it's not just seeing a flower, a red flower, but seeing a red flower in a context filled by our memories, likes, dislikes, emotions, hopes, and feelings. The context gets significance over the otherwise, if I may, boring singular sensations. When our eyes see a flower, there is a rich context that fills our perceptual experience. And that is why our experience is not just here is a flower, but much more than that. It is important to ask, is self a just static placeholder to affirm or dismiss the subjectivity of experience? Considering our lived experiences, self is a dynamic entity that can challenge other selves and is also challenged by other selves. Self does not appear to us as just as a sum of all sensations, because definitely it is something more, which is revealed only through the personality and attitudes of the person, which is going to be day-to-day experience. And it is that something more which makes all the difference to our personal lives and adds richness. Such a self is unavailable, if I may say, in the animal world, and hence cannot be understood however much artificial experiments are done with the animals. Some evolutionary biologists consider that the concept of consciousness can be dismissed. Is consciousness needed? Why do we need one? Such a view emerges from the premise that all that which we are is a sum of our cognitive abilities and related behaviors. It is interesting to look within and ask, are we just machine-like, performing only rule-based cognitive tasks? Is not being a human much to do with the emotions and feelings we give and take, the worries and joys we experience, the hopes and expectations we cherish, the values and visions we build, the constant exploration we engage in to know our true selves? What is the self? Can it be defined by its characteristics and functions? Let us attempt some definitions for the self, though any definition for self has been problematic, as you know, since historic times. There is a continuity in all our experience which brings forth the past, present, and future at the same moment. We are capable of thinking using information from past and expectations about future. Memories are closely connected and are contiguous to all our experiences. Such continuity is felt as adhering to a single unit of consciousness, which we call as myself. We are able to give interconnected meaning to our experiences, learn from our mistakes, form beliefs, cherish hopes, have insecurities, express emotions, reflect upon faux pas we make in life, all these rich forms of experience with an unwavering unity and coherence. The first and foremost features of self are being, the capital B, to put it more experientially, the I am-ness, which Professor Binoy Chakravarti mentioned his talk as I am, and also continuity, adherence, coherence, and unity. All through these several features of self, what runs is that at any point, we are capable of different degrees of awareness and emotion and reflection. Perhaps in the evolutionary scale, what marks the human self distinct is our capacity to be self-aware, not just aware, but self-aware in multiple, complex, deeper levels. Our actions are of not just do a task and get a reward. I don't think we do in life, perform actions in life, just on a reward basis. However much we reduce the human self and identity to physical processes, there seems to remain an irreducible, adamant, inseparable core self that is marked by human sensitivities and frailties. In the works of several neuropsychiatrists of recent times, we see how they use the first-person account of experiences of their patients to understand the construal of agency and experience in challenging situations. These accounts have brought in the humanizing picture of the brain and given an alternative perspective to understand the brain and the body. And one of the names, and who is my favorite author, Jonathan Call, is, in a telling manner, narrates the case of patients with spinal cord injury. In Still Lives, Jonathan Call gives an account of the responses he received from people with quadriplegia due to spinal cord injuries for the question, what it is like to live without sensation and movement in the body. If the body is dysfunctional, where does the self reside? Call finds that there is no single or simple answer. Call presents a narrative of their experiences through 6 telling descriptions of what we could put together today as self. And these telling descriptions of self, which Call makes, are enduring, exploring, experimenting, observing, empowering, and continuing. What is significant about such neuropsychiatric literature is the shift in the focus from third-person neural data to first-person qualities of willpower and self-effort. Self is studied through an engaged self-exploratory method with the intervention of values and positive dispositions. The first-person qualities are being recognized as pertinent to cope up with challenging physical conditions and to help achieve some neural and experiential progress. The reductionist theories of self are overtly detached from a lived life and therefore does not give the space for exploring its own possibilities. In Damasio's own admission, I quote, "Nature lacks a plan for human flourishing." But then what is comforting is nature's humans are allowed to devise such a plan. And to devise a plan for human flourishing and the well-being of ourselves in our moment-to-moment lived experience, it is necessary to look within. A well-known Upanishadic verse, which many of you in the audience would know, goes like this. The self has no sensory apparatus directed towards itself. Since sense organs are directed outwards, it can see only the outside and not the inner self. Looking within is the wholesome recognition of the person. Friends, this morning we present to you perhaps some of the most distinguished scholars and experts to talk to you and share with you on the idea of self. Anand Paranjpe, who is known for his most important book on self, based on Indian psychology and also Western traditions. Natalie Depres, he's the leading phenomenologist, also working with Buddhist traditions, French philosopher. Nilanjana Sanyal, who works on positive psychology, and again, who pleads for first-person approach. Max Wellmans, yet again, a very well-known philosopher who has written on very different aspects of consciousness, focusing on first-person approach. Jonathan Shear, the founder-editor of Journal of Consciousness Studies, and who has spent many, many years studying meditation practices. Sridhar Sharma, who is again a well-known figure in the field of neuropsychiatry and particularly worked on the aspects of culture and self. Gautam Chatterjee is a philosopher from Varanasi and perhaps one of the few translators of books like Tantraloka, and he's an expert in Kashmir Shaivism. Philip Clayton, friend of mine, and again, a very well-known philosopher and a leader in higher education in America. And some of these people are who are going to be here with us today will share with us their research findings, the essence of work, many years of their work, and finally we would have a panel discussion which would by and large focus on the theme for the day, but would also try to bring in some of the discussions we had yesterday and day before yesterday. So now I leave the stage for Professor Philip Clayton to start the first session. Philip.
Thank you, Sangeeta, for so beautifully setting in motion the major themes of today. I welcome you to the first session of the final day of this conference. It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Professor Anand Paranjpe. Educated at Pune University and Harvard University, he served most of his career at Simon Fraser University in Canada and currently carries the title of Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Humanities at Simon Fraser. His topic, Finding the Self and Losing the Ego in the Fourth Stage of Consciousness. Please welcome Professor Paranjpe.
That it is overwhelming. Now that the gauntlet has been thrown at me, I'll try to run the gauntlet. I wish to speak today exactly about the topic, the title, about looking inward. And there are not just one, but many ways of looking inward that have been developed in the West and in the East. I wish to concentrate on two of them, one Western, one Indian, one psychoanalytical in the beginning, and then turn to basically yoga and Advaita in the Adhyatmic tradition. But in doing so, there are, of course, many in the West, many in the East. I will not be touching something like Husserl's more recent way in the West of looking inward, expressed in his great book Ideas as an example, the bracketing and so forth. But associated with the topic are self and consciousness, and that is the one way in which talking about the central issue, self, alternatively expressed as ego, with different meanings to the term. I wish not try to define these terms very precisely because they have acquired different meanings and it will take an enterprise in itself. But I will focus on the concept of ego boundaries, which has been, in my opinion, very ably and initially described and used by Fern in psychoanalytical tradition. And then I will try to say how the concept of boundaries is implicit or explicit throughout the history of Indian thought. First, on the perspective from psychoanalysis, it was Paul Fern who is credited very often with identifying and defining and explaining and using the concept of ego boundaries. He viewed it as, in terms of persons, as continually involved in defining and redefining ego boundaries. And he talked about two kinds of boundaries, boundaries with the external world and internal boundaries with the unconscious. The ego in this tradition is the essential feature of it is consciousness, and it is confronting with the boundary with the unconscious. And according to Fern, weakening or loss of internal boundaries may lead to hallucinations, delusions, estrangement, depersonalization, various forms of pathology or negative aspects of experience. Freud, being a doctor, treating patients with different kinds of difficulties, expected to reduce the pathological anxiety and replace it with common unhappiness, it is often said. That was his enterprise, and Fern added to that use of the concept of these ego boundaries. In my way of looking at it, somewhat differently from Fern's, I think of ego boundary to mean the following. It's an attribute of the ego, as it were, but I also see the ego as whatever entity it is, undefinable as it might be, but it refers to a function of defining, redefining, and often protecting its own boundaries. So with that, one of my Fern was one of my teacher's teacher. My teacher was Erik Erikson, who took up Fern's ideas of ego boundaries, and he added to those psychoanalytic insights from Western tradition through William James, who he considered as his other guru, as it were. What are James's ideas that he combined with psychodynamic insights? Here is a schematic diagram of what William James thought of. He thought of the self, first of all, in two characteristics or two aspects: self as subject and self as object. Now, this is a very crucial distinction, and immediately I couldn't help thinking of the parallels in Indian thought, drashta and drishya. And in the yogic tradition, as well as in the Vedantic tradition, you have drishya, viveka, as an essential feature of how we should proceed in obtaining enlightenment or self-realization. Back to William James. William James then divided self as object into three major categories: material me, social me, spiritual me. He had a way of using terms. He talked about the self as the I and the object self as the me, and further divided into material me, which included the body and the possessions; social me, that is the me as well as we, I versus thou; and spiritual me is a rather confusing term. What he meant by was the intangible aspects, thoughts, for instance, ideas, values, and so on. The material me keeps on changing, the body changing. My son grew to more than about 6 feet, and he tells me that I am vertically challenged, but I am worried about being horizontally unchallenged. That's my body being changing. So possessions, we talk about net worth, which keeps on going up and down. With share values falling, we talk about our extents in terms of our material wealth. Social me, we are always in encounter interpersonally and drawing the boundaries. The closest boundaries and the most permeable boundaries are with our most intimate relationship, friends and spouse, for instance. Or in spiritual me, the ideas, it sometimes appears that what remains same throughout is some kind of an ideology, a way of looking, which itself seems to be changed. Nothing seems to remain the same. In other ways of putting it, the ego boundaries are in flux. They keep on changing all the time, or at least across the span of life. And the material body, the James's self, the social self, and the spiritual self, all of them wax and wane, as it were, as time goes. And we have to constantly be on the side to protect our boundaries and change them to adapt to the situations as we go on. In other words, now here is Erikson's way of putting it as a crucial problem in this whole changing process. We have a sense of identity, who we are. I am the same person I was. William James talked about this in very humorous and wonderful ways, his very picturesque ways of describing. The little toddler that he thinks he is told he was is supposed to be the same as he is as an old man, and he wonders what is it that makes it common. But being one and the same is exactly opposite for being many selves at the same time, and being one across the many and same in spite of changing. The philosophers have talked about this as the challenging issue of the paradox of identity. Erikson's own answer to this was that basically we don't ever get to an identity. It's through varying identifications with friends, with ideas, with various versions of the we keep on changing. There is nothing that remains the self, and therefore, obviously he was looking more at the bodily and other kind of me's rather than object self, and he says that we acquire only a sense of identity, sense of being the same, without probably getting to exactly what is it that remains one and the same. William James had gone back into the intellectual history of which he was a bearer, and he examined the ideas of Locke, Hume, and Kant, and then came on saying almost exactly the same as Kant, that it is this, the way in which we have the same agentic kind of self which can persist across different situations and keep some plan going. So that is the agentic self. But then William James said, okay, what is this transcendental self? He, as harbinger of the new era of psychology, of modern psychology, and as a pragmatist, he was interested in verification and in practical utility. And he said that the self as subject, which seems to be the one that keeps the same, isn't really anything that we can verify in experience, and nor did he find any uses for it, and therefore he discarded it, saying that the contemporary thought is the only thinker there is. And I asked my teacher, Erik Erikson, doesn't he really say the same thing? He wasn't the kind of person to give a straight answer. He used to pull my leg all the time. He didn't quite answer the question, but it seemed to me that it's exactly what he meant. Now, in my understanding, now switching from West to Indian thought, my contention is that in Indian thought, a verifiable, or at least experientially verifiable and existentially valuable understanding or attainment of the self as subject is possible. And the druk or drashta in Sanskrit is what we directly experienced and has existential value. And the idea of boundaries now, I think that it is way back in the earliest Vedas where Ekoham bahusyam prajaye, that is, ultimately it was something one. It decided, for whatever reasons, first of all, it recognized or felt that it was one. How can, if there is only one, there is no other? But this is the mystery of the origin of the world. And that one somehow split itself into many is a speculation on the part of the Vedic thinkers. And Ekoham bahusyam prajaye iti, one divided itself, then what happens? That means centers of awareness are created in a very large or uncountless number of individual beings which are encapsulated in their bodies. So it is as if each center of awareness is now differentiated and caught and trapped, as it were, into bodies. So Kathopanishad seemed to follow this metaphor to say that basically the self-created center of awareness poked holes into its body to have the capacity to communicate with the outside of the world rather than facing loneliness. And some wise man, however, seeking the eternal, turned inward and saw the self, the ultimate self. This is the turning inward that is explicitly the topic that I'm really referring to in the context of the title of enterprise today. Now, remember that Fedon's psychoanalytical internal gaze was focused on ego's boundaries with the id, Freudian id that is, and of the unconscious, and the enterprise was to remove the pathological unhappiness with common unhappiness, not beyond. But Patanjali's inward gaze, however, tries to reach out to the superconscious, so it looks at the other boundary. And Patanjali's yoga may be understood as way of, or different ways of crossing and overcoming even the internal boundaries. How so? In the yama and niyama, let's say for instance, asteya, not to steal, don't cross the boundaries of the other person and snatch something from the other one. In asana, I am trying to control the contours of my own body, make sure where they are. In pranayama, I am trying to control the transactions of the breath in the boundaries of my body. In pratyahara, this is turning inward that is starting, because I am withdrawing my mind inwards. Then, in dharana, I am trying to peg my attention to a specific object of thought, and in dhyana, holding on to a particular thought about a particular object. And samadhi, however, seems to be a way of, or rather, a set of increasingly abstract and focused and self-transforming states of consciousness. So that, here is how one can put it. The five preliminary limbs of yoga, yama to pratyahara, one turns from outside to inside sphere. In Sanyama, the last three limbs, one looks at the inner core, so to speak, the inside the boundaries of the ego, and withdraws attention ultimately till one attains the focus of attention is entirely as what my teacher Erickson used to call the center of awareness. This is how I look at it. According to Patanjali, there are 3 stages once again within samadhi. The lower one based on object of cognition, the middle one based on the means of knowing, which is where cognitive science seems to come in. Much of psychology comes in here. And ultimately, what is it that is really knowing or experiencing? Not simply knowing in terms of practical knowing in the avidya sphere, but what is it ultimately that is the center of attention, center of all awareness? A yogi can be said to then penetrate through these layers and reach the self as subject at the center of awareness. This exercise, this practical way of looking inward and inward and inward, doesn't seem to have been developed in the West as much as it developed in the East. Although you have St. Augustine and so forth talking about the kingdom of God is inside us. But this is a way of actually reaching that kingdom. Now, here is my way of looking at it as a psychologist. In psychology, we understand that maybe there is such a thing as pure awareness, which is probably not quite commonly understood in the Western thought. Freud talked about it in a very interesting way. He says that, look, the mind is like, it's in one of the relatively less well-known papers of his, it's like a children's toy where you have a translucent surface at the top, you scribble anything and it is seen, lift it up and it disappears. Okay, so leave some traces. So pure consciousness is like that translucent body that has no color of its own and it gets empty any time. So that is pure awareness on which sensory data, the Lockean mechanism of absorbing information from the outside, then organizing it through perception, and ending up with cognition with denotative and connotative meanings superimposed. This is the way there seems to be a progression in human life of understanding. What seems to be happening is that these layers, as it were, we go back, delete. So cognition gets filled with content, now it is to be emptied of content. This is one way of looking at my understanding. Or back again, it is like saying that it is nirvikalpa pratyaksha, then savikalpa pratyaksha to nirvikalpa samadhi. Or in linguistic kind of terms, in Bhartrihari's way of looking at it, Vaikhari is the kind of language we speak to go from them to in middle level to upper levels till you get to the para and then the ultimate experience of the self itself. I am borrowing this from Gaurinath Shastri's interpretation of Bhartrihari. Practically speaking, this tradition of how to do it has continued for a long, long time, till more recent times. Maharshi, Ramana Maharshi put it in this way, how to do it? So he says, look where the I thought comes and stay there. Now that is very interesting, stay there. Not only get to understand, but actually experience pure consciousness and stay there. The implication, in my view, is as follows. The implication that is the I is mere center of awareness, which is the expression Erickson actually uses, and being a point of awareness. As a matter of fact, Ram Hare talks about the passage through life as if it's a one point that is going across time and space, but continuing to keep its pointedness all the way along intact. So that if it's, like a simplest camera, which is simply a hole, as long as it is there and keeps that, you will get the images. That seems to be happening. But if it's a point of awareness, a point will tell us. So when one gets there, it seems to be without boundaries. No boundaries are anymore because we have come to a very point state. In my background, Saint Tukaram expressed his experience of getting to that point. And he says that Anuraniya Thokada Tuka Akasha Evadha. The Tuka, the I, is like a point existence with atomic size, and yet it is without any boundaries. It's infinite. Now that is a paradoxical thing in and of itself. How can be without dimension as a point and infinity at the same time? He makes it even more intriguing. He says that Tuka has gulped his own corpse, which was the basis of the misunderstandings about the nature of the self. Now, this is all mystical. Now, in paradoxical terms. But how do I understand it? What does it mean to me? It means that identification with the material me, the I as the body, is what was transcended. And therefore, but then he says, next step, he says, the trilogy of knower, known, and knowledge was transcended. Sandali Triputi Deepa Ujalalagati, which means that enlightenment came when the trilogy, the knower, the known, and the connection between them, this trilogy was transcended. That is the ultimate enlightenment for him. But most interestingly, last step, he says, Uralo upakara paruta. Now that I have transcended these limits, there is nothing selfishness that is the core of my life. It need not be. My life is for everybody else. This is the transformation that we are talking about. Ego, with its boundaries, tries to protect itself and enhance itself. Whereas a saint going through these traditions gets to himself to the point of awareness and stays there. My teacher, spiritual teacher, used to tell me, Swasthabasa. And I thought, how wonderful is this? I can just sit there and do nothing and attain enlightenment. Till I figured out Swastha, the word swa is the most intriguing one, which is what he was asking me to understand and stay there. Not that I can do it. But the realization that self has no boundaries. Now what does that in turn mean? Here are other Upanishadic insights. Bhidyate hridaya granthi chidyante sarva samshayaha Shiyante tasya karmani tasmin drishte paravare. Most interesting. I said, what is it this? What is the knot? Now this is my metaphor. We are talking about the ego boundaries in William Jamesian terms. I have my boundaries, even with my spouse. I say, look, don't trade on this. This is my time today, okay? So I defend that boundary, even intimate boundaries. But ultimately our boundaries seem to, and there is another expression. Hridaya Granthi or Avidya Granthi. And that is to be overcome or cut. And therefore, this is the Avidya Vidya distinction, which I cannot go much deeper into at this stage. But all our ordinary cognitive processes through which we get to know anything is itself has its own limitations which need to be transcended. Now, further, I'll skip. Okay. In Mundaka Upanishad, there are other ways in which this has been pointed out. It explains when something that happens, the experience is Brahman in front, Brahman behind, Brahman below, and Brahman above. Tasmin drishte paravare. I said, what is this paravare? Radhakrishna's definitions gives that, dictionaries give the definition. One seems to get beyond even time and space and limitations of time and space. I am this, I had this lifetime when it originated sometimes in the time of 2 or 3 years or 5 years since I remember, till I anticipate in another few years I'm going to go. Okay. That limitation of time, let alone the spatial limitation, seem to be transcended in the actual experience, which is difficult to understand and appreciate. But then, there are modern sages and saints who have said this. For instance, Sri Aurobindo says, and I quote, the whole world is felt in oneself and oneself suffused through the world. The separate ego either does not exist or is only a convenience for the universal spirit. End quote. That is very interesting. I am absolutely flabbergasted. And I'm reminded of a couplet from Kabir. Jal mein ghat hai, ghat mein jal hai. You know, the same thing inside, same thing outside. Jal inside, jal outside. So he sees it and expresses it differently. Ghata is the boundary of the ego. And something inside, something outside, no difference, he says. And of course, his life was such that no, there was no ego. There was no selfishness. Now, but this would seem from a modern standpoint as pathological. Depersonalization that Fern talked about. So, there are other ways, very quickly, of the idea of boundaries expressed in the Indian tradition. In Viveka Chudamani, thank you very much. In Viveka Chudamani, there is this metaphor that is used by Shankaracharya. It's one of the only ways, one of the few things that is ascribed to be authentically Shankaracharya's, that the ego is like, the persons are like a moth in a cocoon, building a cocoon out of one's own production and living there, ukshati avati, and feeling very safe and very nice and growing inside the limited world that we create around ourselves, the boundaries that we impose on ourselves. So this is how, in other ways, in bhakti, there seems to be a different way of saying the same thing. Look, in graded stages of bhaktis, from Dasya Bhakti through Sakhya Bhakti, through Vatsalya Bhakti, through Madhura Bhakti, what is happening? The boundaries are becoming more and more permeable till they dissolve in a joint two boundaries in Madhura Bhakti. And even that is not the ultimate. What is beyond that is Atma Nivedanam. Atma Nivedanam, I understand as complete surrender of the ego till the ego is no longer needed, except that it may function. How so? Okay. One last one. Metaphor again. Once again, Dvasuparna Sujaya. It is as if a self-realized person has two centers functioning at the same time. One is only watching and witnessing without getting affected with the emotional aspects or others, changing world. The other bird, however, is looking at the fruit and enjoying it, or suffering if it was bitter. So, now, my teacher used to say that his teacher simultaneously lived in two worlds, and in Marathi used to say, Ek pai nirgunat, ek pai sagunat. That is how he saw his teacher. That is, his one foot was planted firmly in the center of awareness, which wouldn't be affected by anything. Back again to the Upanishadic idea of inward looking for seeking permanence. That permanence is there, it's not affected. And however, the ego is functioning. Herbert Fingaret, talking in the mid-50s about mystic tradition, says, he, that is the mystic, suffers, enjoys, knows pain and pleasure, but he is not driven and dominated by these. I think that is how I saw my teacher. Practically involved in day-to-day activities, he has, as if he had all the ego boundaries as husband, father, and teacher, and what have you. And at the same time, never losing his clothes. Hardly anything he seemed to do for himself. Uralo upakara purata. That's what I have seen. That seemed to be one way of resulting in a systematic cultivation of inward looking that has been brought down to us. And of course, my other teacher and the psychodynamic tradition looks at the other side of it, and removal of pathology is just as important for some people who need it, and therefore these different ways are complementary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Paranjpe. I invite you to the microphones. I apologize in advance that I will be strict with question askers who give lectures. So please don't take it personally when I say, please stop, and we'll allow our learned speaker to respond. All right, but I invite especially the students so that we overcome the hierarchy of control by the ones with old faces and gray hair, and the ones who are young and have new ideas can play a major role in the molding and the becoming of our conference. Please.
Thank you very much. I make a small observation. We have started turning inwards. And from Vijnan, we are going to Vijnata. And for this, what is required is, as the quotation goes, Kaschit Dhiraha. We should be bold enough to look within ourselves. And another important point I want to tell you is that we should also look at the Dhivruttayaha, as you were referring to Dridhasya Viveka. Not only the outward objects, and we shall transcend them, and go to examine our mental formations, mental thoughts and other things, and transcend the mind also, so that we can go to the core of our being. And you have made it out very clearly. I am very much, I should congratulate you for that.
Thank you.
And this looking within, as I said, we have to be very cautious about these things. And there are so many techniques that have been initiated in the traditions of Sufis, in the sense of tradition, what is called the Sultanul Askar is there. And the Surat Shabda Yog, the Shabda Yog is there. Shabda Brahmani Nishnataha, Parabrahma Adhigachati. These are all certain techniques which we are not so familiar and not yet being experimented upon. And I wish that we turn to these things in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate. Thank you for the compliment. But this is why I was insistent on saying in the beginning that there is not one but many different ways of looking inward to attain higher levels of existence in human life. Tantras, for instance, there have been so many developed in the Indian tradition, and the leftist tantras, Vamamargis, have been ignored and put down on. But I understand that all those traditions still exist in India today. The living traditions are there to benefit from. And equally, I was exposed to the Western traditions, which there are within the Christian tradition itself, within the Sufi traditions, they are there. Perhaps it has so happened in the cultural context and history of India that many of such have developed and they have continued to live, to pass on the techniques down to us. Sri Vidya, there are so many of them. Thank you for pointing that out. Appreciate that.
Dr. Paranjpe, I'm Srijata. I'm a PhD student at this institute. I don't have a background either in psychology or philosophy, so please forgive my ignorance. My question is, when you were talking about the two aspects of self, that there is one point which remains constant throughout the life and there is the other which changes with our experience, I just want to know how is it different from the biological concept of nature and nurture, that nature, the genetic components remain constant and then with our experience and learning we change.
Yes. Being involved with developmental psychology, I can quite appreciate your concern about nature and nurture. In my undergraduate and graduate days, the distinction and the implications of that were drilled into us. But mainly, maturation and learning, or heredity and environment, are two major forces that guide the development through the life cycle. And that doesn't mean, you can come down to say that ultimately what is inside and comes to unfolding in this so-called self-actualization, if you will, unfolding, maybe the gene, and the gene has the power through all these now wonderfully known mechanisms to build up the body and keep it growing and then of course declining the growth later, as I'm experiencing now at my age. So, but those are two forces or two aspects in which you can apportion the total result in terms of outcomes stage by stage in life. And there is the whole stage, the concept of stages, whether it is psychosexual stages a la Freud or psychosocial stages a la Erikson, or for that matter, any others that have come up. Piaget stages, and you have a whole number of additions. So those are ways of empirically studying and apportioning. But all of them seem to be within the fold, within the domain of what may be ultimately called becoming, changing. And in the West, by and large, but not exclusively, nothing is exclusive here, from Aristotle down to Maslow, it is self-actualization that is continuing to change. And it's wonderful of itself. As long as we are living, we are looking forward to something better that to come before than what we have now. But in India, it seems like more than becoming, it is the being that is stressed. And those are two not exclusive either, as in Prakriti and Purush. They are simultaneously both. And there is a beautiful example of Shiva and Parvati having a dialogue. And Shiva says that, what is terrible thing? You win in the game of dice all the time. I don't. Look, I am Shiva. I stay the same all the time. And Parvati comes on and says, don't brag, please. I'm translating. Okay. You see, because I change, there is meaning to self. That's why you exist, because I exist.
Thank you, sir.
So.
My name is Sajal Chakravarti, and I represent an organization called Indian Center for Social Transformation. One of the, the drastic change in paradigms which has happened over the last century is we understanding our own genome. The entire genetic sequence has been deciphered and is in front of us. And we also understand that we are but in an evolving system. I mean, evolution has been something which is primarily going on. Even neuroanatomically speaking, we have evolved. Now, sir, what I want to know is there a chance of understanding a different realm of consciousness altogether? Because we are changing ourselves. So is there an optimism, an optimistic idea that we would be able to understand the self in a much more pronounced, in a much more, transcendental self? Again, coming back to, I'm sorry, but, again, coming back to it, I would like you also to connect this to the material self, which I feel is encoded in our basic genes.
Sure. The encoding, what I learned from my own background is that this encoding seemed to be working in a certain fashion, which I was told from the biological theories as epigenesis. That is stage-by-stage exploration, where something in the zygote, it so seemed to be all one, but then different kinds of cells appear, increasingly differentiating and so forth. Psychologists, borrowing from this biological model, developed stage-specific development and understood different aspects of development, as in Freud's psychosexual development or Erik Erikson's psychosocial development and moral development and so on. So these initial biological concepts have triggered more ways of understanding different aspects of development through the entire life cycle. But they seem to be understanding based on the externally perceivable aspects of development, what people say, what we can see them doing. The turning inward is a complement to it, to see where is it that we are going, what is the real I, and not simply understand change, but also try to investigate and understand if there's, you see, this is the most interesting and intriguing thing about it, which is that experientially, I do know that I am not the same person. I think that nostalgically I used to have hair on my head, which is no longer there. I might mourn for a day about it and what have you. But regardless of whatever changes there are, I have no doubt that I am the same person. What is it that remains the same? If we attend to that as well, in addition to understanding the reasons whether nature or nurture changes us, whether the genome changes from the inside and the mechanisms of it through whatever biological way of understanding. But counterpart of that, why do we neglect that? And that is where I am attracted by Advaita, where the it is the permanence that is to be sought. Nitya anitya vivek. What we are focusing in the name of science, by and large, is anitya, changing, the other side of it. That's the way to expand, one way of expanding. Yeah.
Professor Paranjpe,
Yes,
since we're so close, short on time, may we take the next two questions together? Then we'll get through all the questions before we run out. So briefly, both together, and he will answer.
Taposh Datta, an engineer but interested in consciousness multiplication. My question is regarding bringing the mind into the ego boundary thing that you talked about. And I take a description of the mind as if having a framework of time, space, and causation, as defined by Vivekananda, to create or look at the world. Now, if you use that, then it seems to me that in order to break the ego boundary, you have to blow the mind, as teenagers love saying, mind-blowing. And if you live in this world created by this, it is never possible to then transcend the ego boundary. So even the greatest saints would have some ego left, and so on. Okay. So your comments.
Thank you. And the next question.
Question directly. We take in more and more samskaras during our daily activities because of our identity, because of the identity and caused by our ignorance. Now, when we are talking about samadhi, where we said that there is a deletion process happening, deletion of samskaras. Now, in that case, do we lose our identity totally? If so, how do we think of finding the source of I, which many people say that it is easy to do in the state of dhyana or samadhi? That's all.
Okay.
Please. Would you like to answer that?
May I also add my question so that
Okay.
time? Okay. It's indeed not a question, but some thoughts have come to my mind. I wanted to express them. Dukkeshu anudvigda manaha sukeshu vigataspruhaha vitaraga bhayakrodaha sthiradhir buddhiruchyate. One more thought. Brihaccha taddivya machintya lokam sukshmacha sukshmataram vibhati.
Thank you. You said what I would have liked to say. Thank you. With regard to the first question regarding the mind, yes, of course, the mind, like the ego, is defined in different ways. Professor Erickson talked about the psyche, the thinking apparatus, the antahkarana. There are different ways of understanding that, and I agree with you that as an engineer you would see that there is something instrument needed inside there to keep track of our being, what is the front, what is at the back, and so forth. And how can we afford to lose it? I think the second question is related to it. I mean, if that happens, as the second question implied, do we lose it all? And that is the fear. That's the fear. And this is why I try to point out Herbert Fingaret's point and also Aurobindo. Aurobindo says that the ego remains as a matter of convenience. It doesn't rule you anywhere. That means there is no fear. It is otherwise, as Fern said, that it would be depersonalization. And depersonalization means that you can't take hold of yourself and be what you should be in different contexts as appropriate to the context. There are different ways of looking at it. For instance, in an autistic child, these boundaries seem to be so firm that it creates a world about itself. And that is pathological. That is not good. But ultimately, if there is no boundaries, there is this fear that we will be completely lost. What we are being assured by people who have actually traversed that path practically, people like Aurobindo as an example, that look, you don't need to fear that. My teacher seemed to be stable. The last question, the comment that you made, the sthita prajnasya ka bhasha, I was understanding more in terms of the behavior of my teacher. It's the practical demonstration of people who really remain outside they remain in the rough and tumble of daily life and are not affected. Like the two birds, the one bird keeps on, the other bird, however, keeps stable. So there is no fear. And, this, otherwise we are creating a monster for ourselves. So our forebears have pointed out what are the implications and consequences of systematic inward looking up.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Paranjpe.
Thank you very much.